Welcome back. We are going to kind of keep going with this idea of tissues, but we're going to talk about some specific pieces here. So, how do we hold the cells together in a tissue? What do glands look like? And membranes. So, we're going to look at a couple specifics here. This is your pancreas, by the way. So, we'll see him come back into play in the endocrine system a little bit later. So one of the things we want to look at is how do we hold cells in a tissue together? Because for the most part, aside from something like immune cells, cells need to be anchored either to each other or to the matrix. So there's not a lot of cells that should be able to function on their own. And so we're going to start by looking at cell junctions. So here we're obviously looking at epithelium. Here's our basement membrane. Here's our apical surface. And we're looking at a representative of what's called a tight junction, a desmosome, a gap junction, and then we also have a hemidesmosome down here as well. So we're going to start up here with tight junctions. Tight junctions are going to form a watertight seal in between two cells. This is going to be really important in terms of things like the lining of your stomach. We don't want the gastric juice that's inside of your stomach, that would be out in the lumen out here, to be able to go in between the cells and begin to damage the tissues under the epithelium. So we have tight junctions. And here what you have are adhesion proteins that are going to kind of link fingers with each other to form this watertight seal. It's going to make sure that nothing can get in between these two cells. These are not really designed to withstand huge amounts of strength. They're not going to provide that for the tissue. They're designed to create this seal with these adhesion proteins. The next type is called a desmosome. Here we're going to have cytoskeletal elements. So we've got intermediate filaments, which are incredibly stable, that are going to be attached to these plaques that are then attached to multiple adhesion proteins. These are where we get the strength to hold cells together. Desmosomes are like spot welds. They're so strong that they will stay put even after the cell has died. So, if you think about it, our skin doesn't just fall apart when we die because these desmosomes are still holding everything together. A hemidesmosome is half of a desmosome. So instead of holding cell to cell, a hemidesmosome holds the cell to the basement membrane. So in terms of epithelium, a very important structure. We need to make sure that the epithelium stays in contact with that basement membrane. The third one is what's called a gap junction. And this is actually almost like putting a tunnel from one cell to the other. So it allows the cytoplasm of one cell to be connected with the cytoplasm of a neighboring cell. So this functions in communication. It's going to let things like ions and cell signals and action potentials and things like that pass so quickly from one cell to another that we can gain a significant amount of functionality when we have gap junctions present. We're going to see them in the nervous system. We're going to see them in the heart. That's what allows all of those individual heart muscle cells to function as a unit, is that they're all connected by gap junctions. So while we're not going to see them all the time, these are definitely coming into play in holding all of the cells either to each other or to the matrix. So now we're going to talk about glands and then membranes. These are two kind of specific examples of tissues. A gland is a either unicellular or multicellular structure that produces and secretes something. Depending on if the secretion is going to be useful, it's called a secretion. If it's a waste product, it's called an excretion. So if you're excreting something like your sweat glands, that would be an excretion. If you're secreting something like a hormone, that's going to be a secretion. We classify them based on where they release the product. We classify them into two different types. Glands can either be exocrine or endocrine. They start off with the same undifferentiated epithelium. So all glands are made of epithelium. In an exocrine gland, the structure is basically going to hollow out. So we're going to get a disintegration of these cells in the middle, and it's going to create a duct. So these cells will secrete their product or their secretion or their excretion into a duct onto a surface. So if this is a sweat gland, the surface is your skin. If this is a digestive gland, the surface is the surface of your stomach. But it's all going to come through a duct up to the surface. In an endocrine gland, you get the migration of a blood supply into this sort of conglomeration of epithelial cells. And that's going to cause the disintegration of this component. And it's going to separate the surface epithelium from the glandular epithelium. These guys are going to secrete into the blood. So exocrine secretes into the duct onto a surface. Endocrine secretes into the blood. We're going to talk all about endocrine at the end of this semester. We're going to do the entire chapter on the endocrine system. So for now, we'll continue to focus on exocrine. So we have unicellular exocrine glands. Mucus cells, goblet cells, those both deal with mucus. Enteroendocrine cells that we find in the stomach, the small intestine. These are all just one cell that's going to secrete something. They're all sort of embedded in epithelial linings. So you're not going to find these away from epithelium. They're embedded in them. In fact, you saw some of those goblet cells in your tissues. So in simple columnar and pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, you saw goblet cells. This is an example of a goblet cell. So you can see that you've got a lot of secretory vesicles all filled with mucin in this case. That's the protein that's going to make mucus. So this is just a single cell that is going to produce and release its product. Now, the structure of exocrine glands can be super, super simple or like get really compound and very complex. Simple basically means there's only one duct. When you look at the structure of exocrine glands, you're going to have cells that are called secretory cells. This is where we make our product. And then duct cells. They don't secrete anything. They're just literally ductwork that's leading out onto the surface. So if you only have one non-branching duct, then you're going to be classified as simple. If you have multiple branching ducts, you're going to be compound. So simple versus compound has to do with the structure of the duct. The secretory component, the red cells, can either be what's called tubular, in which case they are somewhat tubular in shape, or alveolar, where they're more rounded. Alveolar is also known as acinar. So that is another term for something that's kind of rounded like that. So it could be something super, super simple or really get fairly involved when you get into things like salivary glands and mammary glands and things like that. Now, we can also look at exocrine glands based on how they secrete. So not only can we classify them based on the structure, we can look at their mode of secretion. Merocrine are going to simply use exocytosis. So merocrine is just going to release exocytosis So the secretory vesicle simply fuses with the plasma membrane, and we release the contents into the duct. Merocrine are also sometimes called eccrine. Most of your salivary glands, lacrimal or tear glands, sweat glands, things like that are all going to be merocrine. Mammary glands also are partially merocrine and partially apocrine. They release the sugar and protein component of breast milk via merocrine secretion. However, the fat component of breast milk is going to be released using an apocrine mode of secretion. Here, you actually have a membrane-bound vesicle that buds off, and it's budding off of the apical surface, hence the name apocrine. The third type is holocrine. We're going to see holocrine glands in your skin. Sebaceous or oil glands are holocrine. Good way to remember this is holocrine, the whole cell is going to be released. So you release a cell into the duct and then it begins to disintegrate, and the secretion is going to be much thicker than what we would see here or here because you're releasing the entire cell. Now, because you're consistently losing cells, you're also going to see a lot of mitosis in a holocrine gland. Not going to necessarily see as much mitosis here or here because these cells stay put. These cells are disintegrating, and so we're going to need a lot of cell division to keep up with that. So you can classify based on shape. You can classify based on mode of secretion. We will revisit this topic in the skin when we get to all the different gland structures that we see there. Now we're going to talk membranes, so another kind of specific tissue component. There's basically three types of membranes. Cutaneous membrane is your skin. It's the only one that's dry. So we're going to talk about the skin in our next chapter, so we're not going to get deep into that now, but it is the only one that is a dry membrane. Mucous membranes are going to line pretty much all of the cavities that are open to the exterior of your body. The nasal passages, your respiratory system, your digestive system, the genitourinary systems are all open to the outside world. They're going to be lined with mucosa or mucous membranes. The third type is a serous membrane. Here you're going to be lining the cavities and the surface of organs. They are going to be a little bit different, these two. They are both moist membranes, but structurally they look a little bit different. So mucosa or a mucosal membrane is going to generally have some mucus, so we would see things like goblet cells involved. You've got your epithelium, you have your basement membrane, and then you have a fairly thick lamina propria. So this is loose areolar connective tissue that is going to have a big, huge blood supply, lots of fibers, usually immune cells down here. And then generally under that, you have a thin layer of smooth muscle. So that's a mucous membrane. A serous membrane is simple squamous epithelium, a basement membrane that's really super thin, and then this really, really thin layer of loose areolar connective tissue. So it's very, very thin compared to what we see up here. Okay. So this is designed to just be this very, very thin membrane that would allow two structures to kind of rub up against each other. It's going to secrete serous fluid, so a watery fluid as opposed to a mucus, and that's going to allow the two sheets to kind of rub up against each other. This one is going to be dealing more with mucus. It's thicker, it's more protective, hence it's open to the outside world. So cutaneous, we're going to talk about later. Mucosal and serous membranes we're going to come across over and over and over again as we go through the semester.